it's probably pretty obvious that the first step is to dismantle the drum, take all the hardware off, so you just have a raw shell. Step 2 is to sand the shell using 120 grit paper on a sanding block. I used a 3M sanding block, or you can use a random orbital sander. Carefully, just don't leave it in one place for too long and don't press down too hard. I quickly moved outside when I realized how much dust was being created, and I put a mask on as well just to be safe and not get too much junk into my lungs. It ended up taking about an hour total, maybe an hour 15 minutes to sand the whole shell by hand. One thing that's important to remember when you're sanding a drum shell is to be careful not to sand the exterior bearing edge. You can sand right up to it, but just don't sand that curve that's on the edge of the drum. Now it's time to clean your hardware. The hardware that I have on this drum, was powder coated. And when it went through the fire, it left a lot of ugly stains on the powder coating and messed up the powder coating in some spots. So I just went ahead and sanded it all off to basically its raw metal. I used probably 100 grit Dremel attachment for the drill, and that made things go a little quicker. And then I also used 120 grit and then 220 grit sandpaper, and sanded by hand after I got all the worst of it off. And it took a while because you had all those different parts and all the little nooks and crannies, but I think it was worth it in the end. Then the next step is to tape up the interior of the shell so that stain and finish doesn't drip through the holes. I used painter's tape, and make sure you tape up the bearing edges really well. And then I used earplugs inside all the holes to plug them to keep anything from falling through there. Next, you want to make sure that you get the shell really clean and all the dust off, so I use mineral spirits with a cheesecloth or other lint-free cloth to wipe it all off. And then once that dries, I add water so that the grain opens up to allow the stain to really enter into the wood. But once the wood grain opens up a little bit, it leaves little tiny hairs that rise up, and so you need to sand that off with 220 paper, and then use a tack cloth to clean up that sanding dust. And then you are ready to apply the first coat of stain. Water-based stain requires a synthetic brush, not a natural brush. And then I use old t-shirts to wipe off the stain and get that first layer right into the wood. If you want a darker stain, you're going to repeat steps 8 and 9. And I actually screwed this up. The first time I applied 3 coats instead of just 2, and didn't like it. It was too deep, too dark, so I had to sand off the entire thing and start fresh. And then once the stain fully dries, you're going to use a tack cloth to clean off any dust, and then you apply the first coat of your finish. I used polyacrylic satin by Minwax. So once again, I use a synthetic brush to brush on the finish, and that does leave some brush marks, so wait for the finish to fully dry, then use 300 to 400 grit sandpaper to make everything smooth, get rid of the high spots. Then I actually used a razor to kind of go along the entire surface to make sure there was no dust, and then use a tack cloth for final cleaning, and then I put another coat of the finish on. And you really want to make sure you even it out, it's not too heavy in one spot, and let it dry. And then you do as many coats as you want. I did 5 coats. And once you're done with that, you're going to sand the final coat using progressively finer grit paper on a sanding sponge. I did 400, then 600, then 1000, then 1500, and then finally 2000 grit. The surface should end up super smooth like a baby's butt, and it's pretty exciting to have such a smooth surface at that point. And then the cool final step is that you're going to use a random orbital sander with a foam pad topped with Meguiar's Ultimate Compound. Don't put too much on there, you make a mess. But you're going to rub down the entire shell, and I did that several times, and then you wipe off all of the compound and you have a nice shiny shell. And then you remove all the tape and use the drill to push out all those earplugs out of all the holes, and then reassemble the drum. I hope you enjoyed watching this and that it was informative. This was my very first time ever finishing a drum and working with wood, staining wood and finishing wood like this. So it was a little bit of trial and error, but I did learn a lot by watching the other YouTube videos, and I appreciate everyone who has put out tutorials. And if you enjoy what you see and you want to see more drum videos, go to my YouTube channel, which is Mark Pagani Drums, and good luck with your restoration.